All right, let's get into it. What we're doing here is basically a strategic briefing. Think of it as a postmortem on the historical cycles of market concentration in America. And look, the goal isn't just a history lesson. The point is to really dissect this pattern to find some actionable and frankly non-consensus investment ideas.
You know, in our world, everything comes down to the 3 M's, right? Moats, margins, and management. We build these incredibly complex models to price them. But what if our whole framework is missing the one variable that historically has been the single most destructive force for concentrated capital? The one risk our spreadsheets just can't see. It comes down to these 3 words: regulatory, regime, change. And this is not just another risk factor you can check off on a list. No, this is the historical black swan. It's the catalyst that comes in and completely reprices entire markets, shatters what everyone thought were unbreakable moats, and wipes out decades of accumulated capital in a shockingly short amount of time.
So our objective here is to reframe this whole dynamic. We're going to stop looking at the political fight between monopoly and democracy as something for the opinion pages. Instead, we're going to treat it for what it is: a repeating, and because it's repeating, a potentially investable cycle of capital concentration and then its inevitable destruction. And that brings us to the whole point of this briefing: developing what we call a variant perception. It's a non-consensus view, right? It's based on a much deeper understanding of systemic risk. And the thesis here is pretty simple. The market is profoundly mispricing the long-term stability of today's market Goliaths. So let's start with our first case study, the anatomy of the original Goliath moat. We have to go back to the 1920s, the Mellon era, because it's our archetype. To really get a handle on the risk, we first have to understand how these seemingly impenetrable fortresses of capital are actually built. Listen to this quote. "This isn't just some business philosophy. This is a political doctrine." You have Andrew Mellon, the Treasury Secretary, arguing that concentrated capital is the very foundation of civilization. This whole ideology, Mellonism, it wasn't just accepting the fusion of capital and state, it demanded it. It reframed regulatory capture not as corruption, but as a patriotic duty. And this just lays out the 2 poles of the cycle perfectly. On one side, you have Mellonism, a system engineered for stability and high margins by fusing government and big business. And on the other, you've got Brandeisism, the belief that a dynamic economy needs decentralization, fair competition, and a hard wall between capital and the state. This isn't a left versus right thing. This is a fundamental conflict over the very structure of the market. And the results of Mellonism? Peak concentration. You had this unprecedented merger wave where single companies ended up controlling over 70% of their entire industries. Now, imagine you're an investor in the mid-1920s. These look like perfect assets, unbreachable moats delivering annuity-like returns seemingly forever. Okay, so now we get to the second part of the cycle, the Great Repricing. And we're analyzing the 1930s not as a political story, but as a catastrophic systemic risk event for all that concentrated capital. This is where the bill for all that regulatory capture finally comes due. Just look at the speed of this collapse. The '29 crash was just the tremor. The earthquake came after. By '32, the Treasury Secretary himself is facing impeachment as the face of the money trust. A year later, you have public hearings that systematically destroy the social license of Wall Street's leaders. And then came the structural change, laws like Glass-Steagall, which weren't designed just to regulate, but to fundamentally deconcentrate the entire financial system. And the agent of this repricing, it wasn't an economic force, it was political, and it was personified by guys like Congressman Wright Patman. He didn't just attack Mellon's policies, he attacked the core legitimacy of the entire system. From a risk management standpoint, Patman is the absolute embodiment of a political tail risk that is totally invisible to standard financial analysis. So here's the crucial takeaway. The terminal event for the money trust wasn't a market correction. It was a political revolution. The market repriced these once invincible assets not based on their future earnings, but on their sudden and frankly violent loss of political legitimacy. Now, for decades, this pendulum swing, from concentration to backlash, it was just the rhythm of the American economy. But then, in the 1970s, the cycle just broke. And this is the pivotal moment. It's the anomaly that created the intellectual and regulatory vacuum where today's tech Goliaths were born. The source calls this moment the patricide. A new generation of politicians, the Watergate babies. They come to Washington. They see this 82-year-old guy, Wright Patman, the last of the New Deal populists, and they just see an out-of-touch relic. His lifelong crusade against monopoly power? To them, it seemed completely irrelevant. So with a little quiet encouragement from the banking lobby, they oust him from his chairmanship.
And in doing so, they unwittingly dismantled the primary political check on capital concentration that had existed for 40 years.
And this political coup had intellectual air cover, a massive shift led by thinkers like Richard Hofstadter. He basically reframed the entire history of the fight against monopoly. It was no longer a core principle of economic liberty. No, it was dismissed as some emotional, misguided crusade born of status anxiety. The intellectual ammunition to challenge bigness was being systematically stripped from the arsenal, and you can see the new logic that took hold right here. The old populist fear of monopoly as a threat to democracy, that gets replaced by this new scientific view that bigness creates efficiency. And the goal of economic policy? It shifted from ensuring fairness for producers to ensuring consumer welfare, which was defined almost exclusively by one thing: low prices. This was, for all intents and purposes, the intellectual triumph of the Chicago School.
So, this new intellectual soil, it allowed a totally new kind of moat to grow, the informational moat. Suddenly, you have network effects, platform control, data capture. These are the new tools of dominance. And because the only question regulators were taught to ask was, hey, does it lower prices? The old antitrust framework was completely unequipped to even see this new form of concentration, let alone do anything about it.
Which brings us to our final section and the core investment thesis. We've looked at the cycle: concentration, backlash, and a 50-year anomaly that basically put it on pause. The critical question for any portfolio manager today is, where are we in that cycle right now?
Well, this chart argues pretty forcefully that we're living in a historical echo. You see the peak of industrial concentration in 1929, then the decentralized economy of the post-war era, and then you see today. By a lot of metrics, current market concentration is back to, and in some areas has even passed, the 1929 peak. And the argument is that this implies a similar level of systemic fragility.
So this really frames the core portfolio bet for the next decade. Thesis 1 is Goliath resilience. This is the belief that today's informational moats are just different, that they're truly unbreakable, and that the efficiency argument will keep winning the day. Thesis 2 is our variant perception. You hedge against the return of populism because you believe that regulatory backlash is the single most mispriced tail risk in the market today.
So, the core of our variant perception is this. The entire 40-year bull case for today's monopolies rests on a political and intellectual environment that was a complete historical anomaly. They grew up in an era where the political muscle needed to challenge them had atrophied. Our thesis is that that muscle memory is now returning, and with it, the black swan risk of regulatory regime change.
So we'll just end with a question for you to think about. In a world of Goliaths that are facing a potential populist awakening, what's the ultimate behavioral edge for an investor? Is it building a better discounted cash flow model? Or is it developing the historical perspective to identify the political risks that remain completely invisible to the rest of the market?